And we are finishing this class. This is over. I don't know what movie I'm going to show you next tomorrow, or maybe we'll just prepare for the final. Please study for the final. Let's just talk about this time now from the 70s to the 80s. We'll probably finish. It's impossible to really come all the way now. But I just want to talk about, you know, the 80s, Cindy Sherman, a woman that starts photographing herself in movie roles to talk about the condition of women in media and in art. She's one of the big players that has gone from the late 70s to 80s to the 90s to today. I also want to talk about an incredible painter. He's half Puerto Rican, so that's very exciting for me, and half Haitian. His name is JeanMichel Basquiat. There's a great film about JeanMichel Basquiat by another great painter called Julian Schnabel from the same era. And JeanMichel Basquiat just brings this intensity, this violence, this Afro-Caribbean sensibility, and also, like Van Gogh, the tortured soul. He used drugs, he died of an overdose. So all these contribute to the legend of Basquiat, but in essence, his work combines text and image, and sort of aphorisms and sayings from the Afro-American community, from the Haitian community, even from the Puerto Rican side of things, all in a style that is so raw that it caught people's attention. Again, a little bit of that shock. Andy Warhol loved Basquiat and promoted Basquiat, and he became a darling of the art world circuit because even though he is African American or Afro-Caribbean, and then some people might just say, oh yeah, underprivileged, he came from, you know, well-to-do father, had good education. So this guy was not an accident. This guy knew what he was doing, knew what he was going for, and unfortunately left too soon. But so we're talking about Basquiat, we're talking about Cindy Sherman, and we're talking about an incredibly, what do you say, sharp aesthetic, the aesthetic of Barbara Kruger, who would take things like from Life magazine photos and then put little messages. And that started showing up all over New York in the 80s, you know, your body is a battleground, okay? And things like that. And there's another woman called Jenny Holzer that would also do text-based art. This is the time also when you have the Gorilla Girls, like a group of women that never gave their names, you know, they're incognito, and they would put these posters, you know, attacking the establishment of art and the male establishment of art for the few opportunities they gave women. We're talking also at a time, the late 70s and early 80s, where you have a place called Taller Boricua, where Puerto Ricans are printing in the Upper East Side in Harlem, you know, Spanish Harlem. We're talking about all these people coming together and doing art. This is the time when a guy like Juan Sanchez, also a professor of mine from Hunter College, goes to Cooper Union and starts doing this incredible medley of graffiti, derived art, with political advocacy for the liberation of Puerto Rico, with elements of popular culture like Bruce Lee and anime characters. So all of this is happening in New York in the 80s, and I would just like to end with my own appreciation of this trajectory, because this is art history too. It gets very sophisticated. It goes from the pinnacles of art through valleys and all sorts of styles, all sorts of people. And what do I think as an artist, you know, to share with you as your professor in this class? So there are a couple of things, you know, figurative, non-figurative, you know, technique or no technique, right? Work with your hands or hands off. And so we'll talk about these three things perhaps, and you know, so I think there are both opposites, both poles are very interesting. To depict visible versus the invisible or the abstract, that depends both in the artist and the public's bent of mind. Are you an extrovert or an introvert? Do you like stories? So you want to see people and the narration and this and that, or are you more mystical, more contemplative, more you know, like you're always in your head, you don't. So I think those personalities, those sort of fascinations inform the figurative versus non-figurative. And you know, and I like both. I'm figurative, and I'm drawn to figurative because I come from a culture, the Latin American culture, that's all about the story, and you know, Paquito did this, and Maria went there, and so for me, the human element is always of interest, because there's always an incident or an accident or something is going on. So that's cool. And then for the abstract, I don't have that much entrance, but I realize that some patterns, without being able to articulate why, they attract me, and there's nothing going on, there's no story, and they attract me. So there's those two opposites. Then there's technique and no technique. And when I mean technique, I mean mastery. I mean Velázquez. I mean the painters of the Renaissance. I mean, you know, versus like let's say, not that Pollock didn't develop his as a technique, but just throwing paint. And you know, how do you deal with technique? Well, technique is great, and I respond to technique like a kid in a schoolyard will say, oh, you know how to draw a plane. That's a good plane. I'm trying to draw my plane, but your plane looks really good. So I respect that capacity to do something technically right. But, and this is very important, I find that sometimes the best art veers away from just totally perfect technique. Because sometimes the achievement of perfection in the technique takes over everything else and sort of prevents an idea or prevents a genius to really come through. For example, and I'm not going to talk about art, but about Hollywood film. The technique of Hollywood films is world renowned. We all like to watch Hollywood films, and it's like, wow, it's so smooth. It's like a narcotic. You watch and how everything works. But it's becoming increasingly obvious and frustrating. The stories suck. Nothing's going, I mean, what is this? So I like a good story. I like a good idea in a painting, or a good moment, or the sunlight hitting a table a certain way. And there to be something besides just like painting perfectly or whatever you do perfectly. So there's technique and no technique, excuse me. And then, what was the last point? Do you remember, Frank?
Technique.
No technique and no technique. I don't even remember the last point, but it was another polar opposite. Let me think about it for a minute. So, yeah.